hemp is actually indeterminate, which means it's maturing grain as it's still flowering at the top of the inflorescence there. So that makes harvest timing choice really challenging for a grower. And so having some well-developed models that they can use with key markers to help them make that choice will be, I think, very impactful for being able to overall increase our yields.
That's Dr. Heather Grab from Cornell University. This is the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. My name is Eric Herlock, and today we're going to hear my interview with Dr. Heather Grab. She's a senior lecturer at Cornell's School of Integrative Plant Sciences, where she teaches about hemp cultivation and processing. We'll hear all about her work there at Cornell, plus she's going to tell us about an exciting hemp research workshop coming up on November 15th. It's hosted by the Global Hemp Innovation Center at Oregon State University in conjunction with the USDA. We'll take a quick sponsor break, and then we'll come back with a few nuggets of hemp news, and then we'll talk to Dr. Heather Grab from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. This episode is brought to you in part by IND Hemp in Fort Benton, Montana, where their mission is to provide innovative agricultural products and services to connect American farmers with the pioneers and businesses that see hemp as a way to bring real and lasting change to our communities and planet. IND Hemp. This episode is brought to you in part by King's Agri-Seeds. King's Agri-Seeds knows that farming is local, and they've been screening products for local adaptation since 1993. Using their research farm in Christiana, Pennsylvania, King's is working to ensure seed varieties are fit for the East. Hemp is no different. Whether you are growing for grain, fiber, or CBD, King's Agri-Seeds has you covered. Give King's a call at 717-687-6224 or visit kingsagriseeds.com. All right, welcome back. Can you believe it's the first week of November 2022 already? Mind-blowing. Anyway, a couple of nuggets of hemp news for you today. This first story comes to us from Virginia. I found it here on wavy.com, and it says that a company is committing $17.5 million to make Virginia Hemp Manufacturing Center. The story is written by Ivy Tan, and she writes that 45 new jobs are coming to Mecklenburg County after Governor Glenn Youngkin announced on Wednesday that a company that produces fibers for the textile industry and processes hemp and other agricultural products will be making its home at the former Kinderton Distribution Center building. According to a statement from the governor's office, plans have been set for FiberX Holdings, a company that develops technology to process raw agricultural biomass into refined natural fibers, is to invest $17.5 million to establish its headquarters and production operation in Mecklenburg County. So there you go. All right, Virginia. Along the same lines, here's a story out of Wichita, Kansas. I read this on KWCH.com, Channel 12 News. It says that hemp grain and fiber processing facility is opening in Augusta, Kansas. Midwest Hemp Technology announced the company's opening of a hemp grain and fiber processing facility in Augusta. The 4-acre headquarters includes multiple buildings and storage facilities. Midwest Hemp Technology produces hemp grain, food products, hurd, and fiber. When I read the story, I then sent a message to Midwest Hemp Technology to see if I can get an interview with their CEO, Sarah Stevens. So hopefully at some point we'll talk to her about this new facility. So congrats to you all out there in Kansas. Kansas is really putting itself on the map hemp-wise, with South Bend Industrial Hemp and Prairie Band Ag, and now Midwest Hemp Technology. So yeah, Kansas. All right, and then just one reminder about the Pennsylvania Hemp Summit that's coming up on November 14th and 15th in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Go to pahempsummit.com, register for that. You get a discount if you're a Pennsylvania hemp permit holder. So lots of great stuff in store for you this year at the Pennsylvania Hemp Summit. All right, what else can I tell you? Well, I've got some cool interviews coming up for you for future shows. I just interviewed Dr. Ryan Quarles from the Kentucky Department of Agriculture, And I just interviewed John Dvorak from hempology.org. He's a hemp historian up in Boston. So look for those in a few weeks. But today we're going to talk to Dr. Heather Grab from Cornell University up there in Ithaca. I think you'll enjoy this conversation. I know I did. Dr. Heather Grab was just a pleasure to talk to, full of information. And turns out she's from Pennsylvania, and her dad read Lancaster Farming while she was growing up. So it's all coming together here. Dr. Heather Grab from Cornell University, welcome to the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Eric. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and to speak to your audience.
Yeah, well, I am so glad you're here. Thank you for sharing some of your precious time with us. I wonder if you could start by giving us a quick introduction.
Sure. I'm a senior lecturer in the School of Integrative Plant Science here at Cornell University on our campus in Ithaca, New York. And there, my role is really to deliver best practices for hemp cultivation as well as on processing, primarily to students that are in our Masters of Integrative Plant Science program who have an opportunity to focus their studies on hemp.
Wow, that's amazing. I can't imagine when I was in college that it would ever be, something that you could study. But, that was a long time ago.
Absolutely. Yeah, Eric, and I'm sure you and probably many of the folks who are part of your audience who have careers in the hemp industry, but I can absolutely say for myself, I could never have imagined having a cooler job than the one I have now.
Awesome. Well, I want to hear all about the work that you do there at Cornell, but first I thought we could talk about this pretty neat educational event that's coming up in a few weeks. It's called the Industrial Hemp Research Needs Workshop. It's being hosted by the Global Hemp Innovation Center at Oregon State University in conjunction with the USDA. So I know you're presenting at this workshop, so I thought maybe you could tell us about it, what people can expect to get from it, some of the goals, what you'll be talking about, that sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah. So this is, I think, really importantly, a free workshop that is available for anyone within the industry to participate in. It's going to be held via Zoom, and I would encourage anyone who wants to go to hempindustryresearchneeds.org, which is the workshop website, in order to find out more details about the event and especially to register. So of course it's free and open to anyone within the industry or the broader public that's interested, but you do need to register for this event by November 11th. So those are some important logistical details, and we can touch back on those just to make sure that everybody gets those. But I think broadly about the event, this is an opportunity for folks to come together and really pinpoint some of the needs. And the reason why I think it's important to have this meeting now is that domestically, our hemp industry is really building momentum. I think anybody who's listening to your podcast will recognize that and feel that as well. We see businesses popping up and solving problems in so many different areas of the supply chain. But in contrast to, other cropping systems, there's these really long, well-established public and private partnerships that help those crop systems to solve important issues and also to build sustainable and competitive industries globally. Mm-hmm. So hemp very much still, although there's a lot of energy and momentum in this emerging crop phase, at least within the US. And we have very limited resources in terms of public funding that's allocated to build and support the industry. So of course, we do have some really great researchers at public institutions and at land-grant universities that have been on your podcast and shared some of the work that they're developing in order to address those needs. But also at the same time, we have a lot of investment in organizations that are in the private sector who also really are advancing on the ground knowledge. And so the purpose of this workshop in particular is to develop and build this really robust industry to have efficiencies in the way that we build that knowledge. So we want to have an opportunity for folks to come together and to communicate across all of these different organizations that have very different roles so that we can avoid redundancy in our efforts to build new knowledge, and we can identify some priority areas that are really supported broadly across the industry, where we can then go in and build some of these public and private partnerships that many other commodity crops have, so that we can really put all of our collective knowledge to work for the hemp
Right.
industry.
Right. That's great. I'm looking at sort of the list of people involved, and there's a lot of great people from all over the place. Could you sort of give us an overview of some of the topics and some of the folks that will be presenting?
Sure. So the intention of this event, because it really is to bring in all of these different voices, whether that's members of the industry, scientists, extension, educators, other experts, allows them to present their ideas for what we need in order to establish this sustainable, competitive industry. And so part of the structure of this meeting was the organizers reached out to people that were having, really diverse areas across the entire supply chain to ask them to pre-record some of their ideas so that those would be available on the meeting website and people could listen to those. So we cover a huge range of different topics, and there was about 22 experts from all over the industry that were invited to share their research priorities, myself included. And each speaker was asked to sum up their ideas in about a 12-minute pre-recorded video. But in total, there is about almost 5 hours of video that was actually posted onto the website. So clearly, I think there's a lot of enthusiasm for getting our ideas out there, and we all as a community have a lot to say, which again, of course, as somebody who is involved in a podcast, you know that very intimately, and so does your audience. So I'd encourage them to go there and to watch all of those videos, maybe set them up on a stream. But I can briefly give you an idea of the kinds of topics that we covered. Sure. And the speakers that were contributing in each of those areas. So again, because we wanted this to be sort of all the way from genetics through the entire supply chain into marketing, we start out with a section that's on genetics and plant breeding, because that's a huge foundation of the industry. And there, Seth Crawford from Oregon CBD, who your audience knows well, Wendy Mosher from New West Genetics, and then Dr. Daniela Vergara, who is our cooperative extension point for emerging crops like hemp here at Cornell University. And she also delivered her talk in Spanish as well, all speaking about this topic on genetics and plant breeding.
Okay.
So the next...
I'm sorry, let me jump in and ask a quick question. Is the workshop, is it all just pre-recorded videos, or is there also like a live component and a discussion?
I'm so glad that you asked that, Eric. So let's circle back a little bit to the broader structure, because of course, this is meant to be a really inclusive event in which we are calling on many voices. So of course, there were some that were asked to essentially just start this conversation to get it going, which is the list of speakers that have these pre-recorded talks, but everyone's voice is valued here. And so part of that is that there's going to be a live workshop event on the 15th. So that'll be a Zoom event in which, of course, again, anybody can register and attend that event on the 15th. Make sure to get your registration in before the 11th, of course. There's also a public survey that was conducted on various different questions to get other people's contributions. And the results of that survey will be shared during the meeting. So again, if you go to the workshop website, you can see that survey there. So it asks individuals about what their research priorities are in the short term, medium term, and long term, and what they see as the best strategies for building these public-private partnerships. Unfortunately, the survey period did just close on Monday. However, I was checking out the website last night, and we're recording this on the 26th. So maybe the USDA will correct this by the time our podcast is released. But if you go into the list of topics for each one of those questions, there is still a live link for you to be able to add your
Oh, okay.
comments in on that survey. So, of course, everyone is invited to complete that survey and to review those video presentations that were recorded. But then there will be this live event that will bring
Okay.
in many different voices from across the
Great.
industry.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up. All right, so back to our topics of conversations there at the workshop. I think you just finished talking about genetics and
Yeah.
plant breeding.
Yeah, so I cover genetics and plant breeding, which is just one of 7 different focus areas where folks were again invited to submit their talks, just as the mechanism to get that conversation started and rolling. So after genetics and plant breeding, we have another topic with a whole lot of contributors coming from across the industry, whether that's research or folks who are again, developing this knowledge on the ground. So sustainable agricultural production section included talks from Bob Pierce from University of Kentucky, from Josh Schneider from Cultivaris, of course, Ben Brimlow from I&D Hemp, and Hunter Buffington from Element 6 Dynamics.
Yeah.
So that sort of covers we've covered the genetics, we've covered the production stuff, but then we move into harvest and materials processing, which was the section that I was asked to contribute a talk to. And along with me in that section, I was super excited to see some other really great names, including Alicia Ratliff from Victus Consulting Ventures, who is an incredible educator and communicator in the hemp industry. Ben Raymond from Victory Hemp Foods, of course, and then also Andrew Bish from Bish
Oh,
Enterprises.
good. Yeah.
The next section really was okay, after we have produced the seed, we've grown this in a really sustainable way, we've harvested, we've maybe even started to get into that initial stage of processing all of these products. What are the big research needs in the manufacturing and supply chain side
Right.
of the
Right.
industry? And there we had talks from Greg Baumaw. Apologies again for anybody's name that I mispronounce here. He's from Flexform. And if you're not familiar with them, they do a lot of composites that are used in the automotive
Oh,
industry and
okay.
are thinking
Yep.
about ways to integrate hemp into those composites. And a name that, of course, your audience will probably very easily recognize, Maddie Mead
Oh,
from
yeah. From
Hempatector.
right. Yep. Good.
So
Okay.
after that, we're moving sort of up the hierarchy of our supply chain, and we have talks that focus on economics and markets. So Eric Seenstra from Vote Hemp contributed a talk, as well as
Mm-hmm.
Bo Whitney from Whitney Economics, and of course Dr. Tyler Mark from University of Kentucky. Regulations, exports, and trade was a whole separate section.
Sure.
And here we had talks again from other leading industry groups. Patrick Atagi, who's from the National Industrial Hemp Council of America. And here's also really where voices come in from the USDA. So we hear from Bill Richmond, who's with the Agricultural Marketing Service, as well as Corey Picklesheimer. Again, apologies on that. And that these pronunciations of names, who's from our Foreign Agricultural Service at the USDA, talking about these exports and trades and how our policies may also benefit from having some research attention applied to them. So the
Right.
last
Good.
section of all of these 7 was really focused on testing and compliance. And there we had talks from Chris Delhorn, who's from the USDA ARS, which is the Agricultural Research Service, as well as another talk from the ARS member, Mark Burhow, on that
Okay.
topic.
Wow, that's going to be an amazing day of information, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And luckily, you can view all of these talks well before the November 15th workshop event, and they are really designed for that. So, of course, again, there's nearly 5 hours of video content that was provided by each one of these speakers in total. And so I would encourage listeners, if they're really excited about any one of those areas, to go in and hear what the speakers who are asked to contribute in those areas had to say.
Right. And then also to, jot down their questions and take them to the workshop and get answers in real time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about your presentation. You're talking about harvest and material processing.
Yes.
So what do you plan to talk about?
So in my pre-recorded talk, I was sort of tasked by the event organizers to cover research priorities that are at this specific chunk of the supply chain around harvesting and materials processing. So narrow in that regard, but broad in covering many of the different market classes that we have within the hemp industry. So we are the needs of the cannabinoid hemp industry, so the CBD markets, are really different than what the priorities are going to be for grain and fiber.
Almost like it's two different industries, right?
Absolutely. It's really three if we include things like grain as well.
Yeah.
So there's a huge diversity of different kinds of needs. And so I was in my, I was asked to just give a 12-minute talk, and I identified 11 different points across those different market segments. And then my role specifically at Cornell is a lot of time spent in workforce development. So I also included some broad topics that relate to workforce development. And I will also say that I benefited a ton from all of the insights of my colleagues here at Cornell. So I'm really lucky to be just one member of a broader hemp research and extension team here at Cornell University that includes expertise all the way from cellular biology of, the development of hemp fibers inside of the stalks, all the way through to that testing end of the market. So developing brand new methods for quantifying things of interest like cannabinoids or terpenes or other molecules. We have food scientists on our team. We have weed scientists. We have pathologists. All the way across the board here at Cornell, we have a really robust research community. And so I really leaned on them quite a bit when I was developing some of the priorities that I wanted to offer as suggestions for the industry.
So have you done work with the Global Hemp Innovation Center previously?
This is actually my first experience being actively participating in an event with the Global Hemp Innovation Center. So I'd previously worked on a series of talks and workshop with the USDA that also happens to include many of the speakers that are on their list here, that was co-organized here at Cornell. And of course, I have attended many of the events at the Oregon State Hemp Innovation Center, but this was my first opportunity really to provide my own voice to the conversation.
Yeah, well, let's talk about your part of the conversation. Can you sort of give us a sneak peek, like a glimpse into what you will be discussing when you talk about harvest and materials processing?
So in the fiber side of the industry, which is where I really spend a lot of time focused with my students, in particular, the master's students that I mentor tend to work a lot in the fiber side of the industry. So what I propose there are some of the research priority areas that I see in doing that work is working with partners outside of the US in order to identify some really important pathogens, weeds, or in particular pests. So, you're there in central Pennsylvania. Central Pennsylvania has unfortunately often been the epicenter of many new invasive pest species, of course. And as an entomologist, this one sort of came really fluidly to me. And so in other crop systems, we work with public agencies like APHIS to understand for the commodities that we're growing here in the US that are also being grown in other regions, what are the pest issues that are popping up in other areas of the world? And how much of a threat would they be if they were to occur here in the US? So this is a more forward thinking goal, I think, for us as an industry, maybe not the immediate priority, but I think something that it's worth putting on the radar. Some of our really more immediate needs here in the fiber industry in the US that also relate to this issue is really around getting good weed management tools overall, particularly, for the fiber industry, because right now we have very limited chemical controls. And so developing strategies that work really well in order to control weeds, because especially at this harvest time where I'm sort of focusing a lot of these recommendations or my offerings for research needs, there are very few options that growers or processors have available to them to be able to separate those fiber hemp stems, the straw, from any kind of weed matter that may show up in the field.
Mm-hmm.
So things like bindweed, for example, that's going to be a huge problem if it gets out of control. And so making sure we have some really good strategies to control those, I think, is a big need. I also
Okay.
think in the fiber hemp industry, we have really effectively leveraged some older technology for harvesting our fiber hemp. So, for example, sickle bar mowers, that's a classic old hay technology that we've been able to almost revitalize and reinvigorate into harvesting our fiber hemp. The downside of using hay processing equipment like sickle bar mowers, and especially when we're flipping that over with rotary rakes,
Mm.
is that we end up with fiber hemp stems that are not oriented in a parallel manner.
Oh,
That
okay.
only becomes important if we then want to market that fiber hemp straw for textile production. So textile production is an incredibly high value application for fiber hemp, and many growers are really interested in finding ways to get their product into those supply chains. But a huge bottleneck is if we're using these harvesting strategies that, just like hay, are harvesting our hemp stems, our hemp straw, and it's ended up falling over in all these different patterns rather than being harvested in a way that's similar to the way we would harvest flax, for example, where
Okay.
those stems are sort of cut off right at the ground, pulled up by a machine, and laid over in this oriented parallel manner. So they're actually never jumbled up. They're never raked over with a
Okay.
rotary rake like we would for hay, but we
Right.
simply don't have that equipment available to us yet here in the US. So that is definitely, I think, a research need if we want to be able to advance our textile industry in particular.
Right. Does that technology exist elsewhere?
It does indeed. So, in European regions where flax production is very common, they've already started to adopt and modify. So, of course, hemp fibers grows so much
So
taller
tall.
than flax does, but they've been able to modify flax equipment so it actually cuts at two different points on the
Okay.
stem and
Mm-hmm.
collects those two portions and lays them down in these nice rows parallel in the field. And then, because just like hemp, flax also requires this retting stage,
Oh,
which is a
okay.
controlled pot in order to degrade compounds called pectins that really are like the plant glues. They hold the cell structures together. And of course, we want to be able to easily separate the fibers from the inner woody core. So we use these retting practices. But in flax retting, they actually have specialized equipment that will pick up these oriented rows and flip them over in an oriented fashion. They also have equipment that can bale that fiber and maintain it in an oriented fashion. And the key reason why this is so important is that these lines that process long fiber really need that fiber to go into the machine in an oriented
Oh, okay.
fashion.
Right.
So that's why it's really critically important to develop that parallel technology so that we can take advantage of the textile processing equipment that's been already developed for other natural fibers like flax.
Right. Wow. That is fascinating. Cool. Um, yeah.
So,
So keep going.
yeah, of course. So speaking of retting, which we just brought up there, Retting, again, that process that degrades those pectins, those plant glues that hold the bast fibers, those long, strong fibers of hemp, to the inner woody core, often also called the hurd. You can do that retting in a number of different ways. And in fact, those really high grade textiles, often we're achieving that retting process not out in the field, but in these really controlled conditions in tanks, in water. Historically, hemp was retted in natural bodies of water like ponds and streams, but that does have a major environmental impact. And also by bringing those into tanks, we can control those conditions much more. However, that process of breaking down the hemp stalks also leaves us then with some, effluent that is also not ideal for the environment.
Right.
So there's a trade-off there. We could do this dew retting, and dew retting can be great. It can return a lot of that vegetative matter into the soil again. So that's awesome for being able to maintain our soil carbon stocks. Dew retting is simply when we cut down the crop and we let it lay in the field. And ideally, we're taking advantage not only of the natural microbes that occur in the field, but also the action of temperature variation, and of course, rainfall is really critical in achieving that retting process. There are some areas of the country, so thinking about the West here, that do not have sufficient rainfall in order to be able to achieve really good retting. In other areas, Pennsylvania, New York, much of the mid-Atlantic and Northeast, we certainly have very sufficient rainfall. And in fact, we may over-ret our crop, which means that we've not only broken down the pectin, but we're also starting to break down some of the cellulose structures that help to maintain these really strong fibers, which we don't want. So field retting has certainly benefits, but also some trade-offs in that it's not as well controlled. And it also takes quite a bit of time. There's risk to having your crop laying out there in the field. So I think what we really need to invest in this area is developing some optimal retting time models for those of us who are in areas where there is sufficient rainfall so that we're not over retting our crop. And then also thinking about potentially some greener technologies to achieve retting in areas where we simply do not have sufficient rainfall to do that. So those were my key priority areas for fiber.
Okay.
I would be happy to touch on the other ones if we have time. For
Oh, we
grain,
do. We've got nothing but time, so go for it.
Perfect. Lovely. So in the grain area, and again, specifically, I'm talking more about the needs for harvest and materials processing for each one of these areas. I think it's really important that we develop some harvest timing models for our grain producers that can help us to reduce losses from that grain shattering. So unlike other grain crops that have specifically been bred and developed over a long period of time to avoid shatter, which is simply the grain falling off of the head as it matures, we don't really have that for hemp. Hemp is actually indeterminate, which means it's maturing grain as it's still flowering at the top of the inflorescence there. So that makes harvest timing choice really challenging for a grower. And so having some well-developed models that they can use with key markers to help them make that choice will be, I think, very impactful for being able to overall increase our yields. Growers are definitely experiencing a lot of loss due to that shatter, especially if they're in windy conditions, but also if they experience high pressure from vertebrate pests like birds. So I cannot tell you how many cool different kinds of birds I have seen out in hemp fields. Some of them are, of course, providing really important services. They're controlling pests in the hemp fields. But many of them that occur late in the year are taking advantage of all of this incredibly nutritious grain. I've seen goldfinches that have eaten so much grain, they literally cannot fly anymore. So, this is such an issue, especially, in our small plot research where it can really, there's not enough to satiate that bird population. They can take out an entire small plot research field of grain. So we know there's certain farms, it's not even worth us planting a grain trial on because the bird pressure will be so high.
Goldfinches have no self-control.
Absolutely not. So it turns out mourning doves are also guilty, I think, of this behavior as well. There's many other species of birds that are certainly eating a lot of hemp grain. Luckily, many of those are not birds that were considered, threatened or that we're worried about. But generally, as a whole, we are pretty concerned about declines in especially songbird populations across the US. So I think we need to balance our strategy here in thinking about how we control those pests. So it's not even just the amount of grain that they're consuming, but one issue is, they're not just eating the grain, they're also pooping grain out on those inflorescences. And hemp grain is a very minimally processed crop. There's not big kill steps that are involved. So there is potentially risk from things like salmonella, for example, that could be
contamination
transmitted
from
by
the
birds.
birds. Okay.
Absolutely. So even outside of the issue of a crop loss from the birds consuming the grain, they are certainly leaving their waste in
Wow. Okay.
those crop
I
flowers.
had
And so
never even
that's
considered
also
that. That's
that's
crazy.
also potentially a concern. But in other crops, so for example, sorghum in Africa, we've developed and selected varieties there that have compounds that are unpalatable to birds, either in like the seed coating or in other components that really have no impact on our ability as humans to sense those compounds.
Mhm.
But that has been a really interesting control strategy that allows us to produce a crop without having to worry about some more aggressive bird control methods that may be a problem given the declines overall in bird populations. So at the same time, I think that's a great strategy, developing those flavor profiles that may prevent the birds from wanting to eat hemp. But I will also say we're at a very early stage in our development of all of these diverse array of food products that can be made from hemp, whether that's something like a plant-based ice cream, for example, or many of the other products that Victory Hemp Food is supplying their hemp ingredients for. One thing that we're really concerned about is what is a contributing factor to some of those really strong hempy flavors, or sometimes even off flavors that can occur in hemp grain, especially when it's minimally processed, like a hemp seed oil, for
Mhm.
example. Are those controlled by the genetics of the particular crop itself? Are there environmental factors that contribute to that during the cultivation period? And especially, how does harvest timing choice impact that? Because there's some immature grain as well as some very mature grain on that inflorescence. And then post-harvest storage and processing factors can also contribute to some of those flavors. So just understanding what
Okay.
are the top flavors and what leads to their higher level in some instances and not in others, I think is really important.
Yeah. Quick question about the shattering. Is that something that could be sort of solved through genetics?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the main way we've solved it in other crops.
Hmm.
It takes a while. Luckily, I think, hemp, of course, we can all acknowledge due to prohibition, has been neglected in terms of its research relative to other crops. But now we have the benefit of all the tools that we have developed over the past decades for other commodity crops that we can really easily switch over and begin to apply into hemp. And so I think we will make some really good gains in terms of developing cultivars that don't shatter as easily and have a more uniform maturity date. But there may be some other strategies that we want to implement in the meantime.
Okay. Cool. So let's move on to cannabinoid hemp.
Sure. So many of your cannabinoid hemp growers will probably agree that a huge headache for them is around compliance testing. It's an enormous cost for them. Getting the timing of it right is super important. And so what I would love to see, and I think the technology is already out there and available, but just applying it to the hemp world, is developing some of these fast and reliable methods that growers can use right there at their crop so that they can monitor the development of things like cannabinoids, for example, themselves in the field. They don't have
Hmm.
to take a sample, ensure that it is representative, send that to a lab, wait for those results to come back, pay sometimes a significant amount of money for every
Sure.
individual sample that they're sending. As somebody who, like I have an HPLC in my lab, I know all of the steps that it takes to process one of those samples and to get reliable results. I would love to have a technology that can do that. And I think there are some technologies that we could apply that are used in entirely other systems in order to give growers that tool to put into
Right.
their toolkit.
Yeah, actually, just a few weeks ago, I interviewed some folks from Mariposa Technology, and they've got this laser that shoots the plant material, and then I guess it beams it to a satellite down to their offices, and they analyze it, and then you get nearly real-time results for cannabinoid levels and nutrients and all sorts of different things. So yeah, it's like,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah,
super
I would
cool.
say Mariposa's technology using Raman spectroscopy is certainly a very promising tool for giving that ability to
Hmm.
growers. There are a range of other portable HPLC applications that are also currently on the market and available. And I think NIR technology, which is near infrared spectroscopy, could also be used. The challenge with that, though, is often water content in the sample. And so that's where tools like Raman spectroscopy really sort of can highlight the ability to take those measurements right in plants because they're not as impacted by the amount of water that's in those plant tissues.
Are you optimistic that at some point fiber and grain growers won't have to be testing for cannabinoid levels and all of those sort of burdensome regulations? Will they be removed?
I hope that that is one day the case. I think there's a lot of stigma overall within the industry that's driven some of this regulation that has had some impacts on the ability of the grain and fiber industry to grow and to be competitive. I would actually maybe go so far as to say that there's a huge slew of other regulations that impact not only cannabinoid hemp producers, but also cannabis producers. So, for the high THC side of the market in states where that is legal. So, things like microbial standards, for example, there is no other crop where we apply the same principle of microbial safety testing standards. So, think, for example, about lettuce. Lettuce kills a lot of people in the US. We do not have lot and batch level testing for microbial pathogens in lettuce systems. We rely on good agricultural practices by the producers, as well as good manufacturing practices, in order to ensure generally that our supply chain is safe for the consumer. We do not use that system in cannabis. That's very unique. So we
Hmm.
use the same system for most other agricultural products. We use these systems for tobacco. We use these systems for alcohol production, making sure that we're using, good manufacturing processes that help to control some of those critical points where there could be a specific threat. I don't see a reason why we shouldn't also apply the same standards to the hemp and more broadly the high THC cannabis industry as well.
You mentioned your work in workforce development, and you'll be presenting some of that information too in your talk. Can you give us an overview of that?
Absolutely. So, as we are building this industry, we not only need to solve some of these really critical knowledge gaps or pain points, but we also need to make sure that we have a skilled workforce as well who's ready to engage and using best practices within the industry. And so, I think part of that is going to be learning from our industry partners what the roles are and what the skills are that they are looking for so that we can develop some really targeted training or even credentials programs to meet some of those needs. And I also think it's essential in developing this industry, especially in recognizing some of the prior impacts of prohibition on particular communities, to identify opportunities that can support training and also to support market access by individuals who come from those communities that have been most impacted by past prohibition that's been broadly applied not only against high THC cannabis, but against hemp as well. And I think we can really lean on some of the work that's being done by colleagues from minority serving land grant institutions in order to help achieve some of those goals.
Yeah, it's disturbing to me to see a lot of like rich white folks getting richer from this plant when there's just, the prohibition decimated communities of color. And I know there's a lot of like social restorative work happening now. But yeah, so I appreciate you bringing that up. Do you see, people joke that hemp is a gateway crop for farming. Are you seeing, like an influx of new farmers?
I would say absolutely yes, but only in particular market segments. And so certainly here in New York State, within the cannabinoid hemp side of the market, we saw a lot of folks who are looking at, especially in the early days of the hemp industry. I'm thinking like back in 2017, 2018,
Mm-hmm.
when farmers were being promised, like $20,000 an acre. For
Yeah.
example, like if you were looking at an alternative crop, if you're already an established grower, let's say a dairy farmer, for example, who is looking at maybe $200 an acre for some of these other alternative crops, of course, you're going to think about making the switch of your acreage into some other crops. And we did see that happen. We also saw that happen to some extent in the grain and the fiber side as well. But the numbers at that period of time weren't quite as attractive as they were for the cannabinoid hemp market. Of course, because our growers within the US are incredibly versatile and able to respond very quickly and grow really good crops, we saw some overproduction in the market, and that
Just a
led
little bit,
prices
right?
to collapse. There was very, and it's not, I'm not just saying it's because like the farmers grew too much. They were promised in many cases
Oh, yeah.
contracts to grow it. There was so much hype around it. And so I think that's, partly what led to that. And so many growers certainly are new farmers are really excited about getting into the industry here. But generally, I see that, at least in New York State, now that we have passed the MRTA here in New York State, which allows for adult use recreational cannabis, I'm seeing especially a lot of interest from farmers of color and from new farmers who feel like they really are starting to get some of the support that they need in order to enter the space. So there is a lot of new farmer interest. It's mostly on the cannabinoid side of the market rather than grain and fiber.
Right. Yeah, that CBD boom and bust, I think, created sort of a second stigma for hemp. Like it's already battling the marijuana stigma, but now there's this CBD stigma too. So hopefully, I don't know. From listening to show that I love the fiber and grain side. I just think there's so much potential there.
Yeah, I hope there's opportunity now for growers. Many of these growers who have licenses, they've grown cannabinoid hemp. In fact, they may have grown enough cannabinoid hemp for like the next decade, for example.
Right.
I've seen a lot of warehouses full of cannabinoid hemp, some of which was grown all the way back in 2018,
Right.
2019,
Yeah.
that may now decide this could be a good moment as we're starting to build capacity in other areas to try their hand at growing grain or growing fiber hemp.
So you are a senior lecturer in the School of Integrative Plant Science at Cornell, and your PhD is in entomology. So how did you get from insects to hemp?
Excellent question. And I would say I still do provide expertise in the hemp or in the entomology area to folks who are in the hemp industry, but it was a big switch for me. And I have to give so much credit for that to the mentoring and teaching work that I did, actually. So I had a student back in my days of being in the entomology department here at Cornell who, this was right at the time that we started to offer some of these hemp research license programs in New York State. And he got really excited about looking at the insect community and hemp. And much of my prior work was focused on, sort of sustainable practices, thinking about how we can use farm habitats and farm environments in order to conserve and support natural resources and to support wildlife populations that are at the same time providing some benefits to agriculture. So, a classic example of this is thinking about wild pollinator populations. And a lot of my work was focused on strategies that farmers could implement on their farms to support native bee populations that would then provide some services to really important high value crops like strawberries or apples or tomatoes, for example. And so I had a student who was working with me on this strawberry project who got really excited about the opportunity to look at hemp, mostly because we had some early reports from growers in our state that they were seeing a ton of bees out there, especially in their fiber hemp field, but also in grain. So remember, this was back in the early days of our hemp program when most people were still, like very early in the development of the industry. We
Sure.
were all growing a lot of fiber and grain hemp before that CBD wave overtook us.
Yeah.
So the student, Nate Flicker, designed a project where he visited a whole bunch of our research collaborator farms and collected bees and other insects that were showing up in the hemp crops there, and then looked at factors about that farm and the habitats around the farm that explained why some farms had really high and really diverse populations of bees and other farms didn't seem to have quite so many. I will say overall, good news for hemp growers
Yeah.
is that there are very few at this moment pests of significant concern in terms of the insect world. There are a few that we see showing up that early in development can cause some issues, or especially on the cannabinoid hemp side, that get into those inflorescences and can cause some damage. But I think one thing that we also at the same time need to recognize in working on strategies to control those pests is that in some cropping systems, especially fiber and grain, there are really diverse communities of beneficial insects like bees, so another group where we're concerned generally about population declines, that hemp is contributing to supporting, and also that we should be thinking about as we may be applying some control strategies for those pests of concern if they do show up. So that was sort of what got me in my transition from entomology into working on hemp. And Nate published a first author paper, which is pretty impressive for an undergraduate student, talking about that research. I can send that to you to include in the show notes for the page in case anybody
sure,
is
that'd be great.
interested in checking out what kinds of bees we were finding here in New York. But because I really, I love teaching, I love mentoring, when this opportunity to have a role as a senior lecturer within the hemp research and extension team at Cornell came open, I leapt for it. So now my job is, actually really full-time just teaching courses that focus on best practices for hemp production. So I have a class I teach in the fall for about 25 students here at Cornell that focuses specifically on everything from cultivar selection through site selection, cultivation practices, harvest timing choices, all of that good stuff. And then in the spring semester, I teach a class that has a whole lab component to it focused on the processing side, which is really critical to match that development, not only of the cultivation side, but also the knowledge and capacity for processing within the industry. So in addition to teaching those classes, I also mentor several master's students each year that participate in our professional master's in integrative plant sciences program. So those are the students that really get to focus all of their studies and a lot of their coursework on addressing key problems in the hemp industry.
Cool. Can you talk a little bit about some of those projects?
Sure. So I say that they're really broad is a great way of characterizing it. So the whole goal of our program is really to not think about developing students into, molds of ourselves as academics, but making sure that they have the skills and knowledge to really enter into this new hemp industry as leaders in the space. So they'll have a really broad idea of the entire supply chain from start to finish that they develop through their coursework, but they do also have this opportunity to focus and develop an independent research project. And I say independent loosely because it's driven by the student. It's sort of like student directed research, but
Okay.
often, always this is occurring with expertise from different faculty members across our hemp research and extension team, and also frequently with members of the industry who want to work together with our students in order to meet a real need that they see. And so I'm really always excited about hearing from industry members that want to work with students. So if there are any of your listeners who are excited about that, please reach out to me about it. But an array of different projects that students have worked on, I will say, they're across, like synthesis. Right now, there's a lot we know in other areas of the world. So by synthesis, I mean not really creating new knowledge, but just bringing together all of the
Sure.
knowledge that we already have. So there is a student of mine, Tony Baracco, who after graduating, he now is working at the new USDA hemp germplasm collection. It would be great to have members of that team on your podcast to talk about the really cool things that they're doing there in that organization in
Yeah, I would
order.
love that.
Yeah, they're developing and protecting really cool hemp germplasm. But when he was here with as a student with me, what he really focused on was developing strategies to develop the fiber hemp industry here in the Northeast. So looking at how these industries have developed in other parts of the world, like Europe, what have been the key bottlenecks there? What have been some opportunities, especially around thinking about co-ops in particular, which is a great way to make sure that the farmers, the growers themselves are capturing a lot of the value of production, which frequently is shifted into the manufacturing side. So
Right.
growers are, we know, putting a lot at stake in devoting their time, resources, and land into growing hemp. So making sure that they are successful in capturing the value of that is really important. And so Tony went and worked with a fiber hemp co-op in Italy to understand how they were, how their system was working, what might work from that here in the Northeast, and also did some work understanding really specifically what some of the benefits are to the environment of transitioning some products like insulation, for example, or composites that could use hemp fiber as an alternative to some of the more synthetic products like fiberglass, for example. So that was, one project. It was really cool, worked on fiber. I've had students who've also worked with companies that are developing some of those point of use processes. So another student, Katie Mazer, who's now working for a soil company that supplies the hemp and cannabis industry specifically, sort of one of their major market areas, worked with me to develop a new application for some existing technology. Some of you may be familiar with the Light Lab, which is produced by Orange Photonics. That's a point of use HPLC system. It's portable, very cool technology that can quantify really important metabolites like cannabinoids. But Katie was really interested as a plant breeder in early detection of what the dominant cannabinoid of a plant was going to be very soon after that plant had germinated, so that we could make really good choices as breeders about selecting crops that have, an appropriate cannabinoid profile for the end market that we are aiming for. So we developed a new application of their existing technology that would help to provide that service to their customers. I would say more recently, there have been other projects that looked at cold tolerance of hemp. That work is also now published. I think what we were concerned about generally here in the Northeast is around what would be the impact of frosts, early frosts that occur in the fall. How might that impact growers? Would there be issues in terms of plant development, or especially cannabinoids in particular? And we found that actually exposure, hemp is very tolerant to frost, which is good news for growers. They don't need to panic and harvest a crop early if it looks like we're going to get an early season frost. So this is probably very salient information right now, because we're approaching that point in the year where we're going to get some early season frosts.
We've had a few down here in Pennsylvania already.
Absolutely. And I will also say other students who are have come to the program because they have a huge entrepreneurial drive. So one of my current master's students already has a fiber hemp processing company and is really looking at building some technical expertise around how they not only communicate and work directly with growers to make sure that they are using best practices in the field for their end use consumers as the processors, but also to think about some ways that they can implement new technologies that can help produce higher quality fibers after that fiber is separated from the stem.
That's cool. I love your energy and excitement when you talk about your students. So those students are very lucky to have you as a teacher.
I feel incredibly lucky to work with such motivated students on such a wide range of different projects. So my current cohort of students right now is in the phase of developing their project ideas.
Okay.
And I think my biggest challenge in working with them, which, is really not a challenge at all, is they have so many really good ideas, and isolating the single idea that we actually have time to execute on in the 1 year span of this program is,
Yeah.
I think, always the most challenging.
How did you get involved in entomology in the first place? Like, were you like a little kid who just loved looking at bugs in a, magnifying glass, or like tell me just briefly your path into entomology, because that's fascinating to me.
I'm so glad you asked that so I can come out of the closet as somebody who's not actually a bug nerd. So here at Cornell, we have, a world renowned program in entomology. We have a whole department of entomology. We have an entomology major. The undergraduate students who come to that program are, I think, all certified bug nerds. They know everything about every insect. But interestingly, I actually came to entomology not through a love of bugs in particular. I would say I have an affinity for all, living things, but no special affection for insects per se. But it was actually when I was doing my undergraduate work at Ursinus College, which is there in Collegeville, Pennsylvania, where I was having some conversations with faculty members there, sort of late in the stage of my undergraduate career. I knew I wanted to go to grad school. I really thought I wanted to work in ecology and conservation, maybe even also some evolutionary biology. But I
Mm.
had these classes that were focused on solving, like applying science to solve real problems in our food systems. And I was really lucky that Ursinus hired an entomologist, Dr. Corey Straub, who started working my senior year and was like, I had this epiphany where I was like, oh, why aren't we using predatory insects to control pests instead of spraying pesticides? And he was like, that's called conservation, biological control. People do that. They're entomologists. Go talk to them. And I did. And that is what brought me to Cornell. Here, I worked with really a whole team of faculty members. My primary mentor was Dr. Greg Loeb, who works a lot on fruit and especially grapes. I originally thought I was going to be working in vineyard systems. But then, of course, the pollinator crisis was
Mm.
evolving right at that time around, 2010, 2011. And I wanted to incorporate not only strategies that would promote beneficial predator insects or parasitoids on farms to control pests, but might also support these bees that people seem to be worried about. So I switched into a system. It turns out, although I tried, uh, vineyards don't generally need bees in them in terms of providing a really good set of a grape crop, but there are
Okay.
other crops that definitely need bees, and strawberry was one of those. So I started working on bees and pest control and pollination services in these small fruit systems. And man, are bees just totally fascinating creatures. Huge diversity in life history, huge diversity in colors and sizes. I encourage you, I know it's a little late in the year, but if you can find any bees out there, to just really give them a close look. There's a ton of things out there that you wouldn't normally think are bees, but they are, because they're metallic green, sort of like midnight blue. They're all manner, somewhat with black and white racing stripes. It's crazy. So that's what got me into bees, and then
Yeah.
ultimately led me to where I'm now, working on hemp and insects and wherever student interests lead me.
Right. That's great. So, as far as I can tell, Cornell is one of the leading universities in hemp research. Um, how did that happen? Why is hemp important, in general to Cornell University?
I would say this happened for a couple reasons, and certainly none of them by chance. So, a lot of that was some really early support by our state government allocating a large amount of funds to Cornell and to other institutions of higher education here in the state, as well as to supporting developing industries in the hemp space. So that investment was really critical in being able to leverage all of the knowledge that we have. So Cornell is a land grant institution, which means that we have a mandate to help solve problems that are important to the stakeholders within our state, within the nation, and also broadly within the world. So that's sort of part of a philosophy that all of us at Cornell carry and try to contribute to. And when we saw, this excitement around the hemp industry that was building, there were many faculty members who sort of stepped up and took leadership roles. Dr. Larry Smart is the current research team lead here at Cornell for our entire program. And I don't even want to think about the countless hours that he has dedicated to the logistics, and all of these conversations that have built the current program that we have here today. So he's sort of helped to put all of those funds that the state contributed initially into action in order to create some knowledge. He got a bunch of other faculty members invested in working within their research programs on problems that were relevant to the hemp industry. And then, of course, relying on our colleagues here in cooperative extension services in order to organize events that brought grower voices and industry voices to the table to help us figure out what their priorities were, and then to develop some science that would meet those particular needs. So we have an enormous team of faculty who are working across many different areas, whether it's weed science, food science, I mentioned before, as well as in cooperative extension, and other areas in order to support our hemp industry.
Great. Yeah, I interviewed Dr. Larry Smart very early on the show, back in maybe 2019. So yeah, he was fascinating to talk to. He was talked about willow too a lot, right? Doesn't he do research in willow trees? I don't know.
Yeah, so willow is Larry's first passion. Or Dr. Smart, I should say. His lab, before he sort of picked up this really important component of supporting the hemp industry, which I think was actually a natural transition from him because he was working on biofuel willows.
Right.
Many of the same technologies, many of the same scientific concepts and ideas that he was thinking about applying to the biofuel willow space are also equally applicable to the fiber hemp space. Of course, he was doing a lot of that applied work on how we build a biofuels industry that's, driven by willow here in the Northeast, but also did a lot of really basic science in willow on things like sex determination, which is incredibly important as well for the cannabis space.
Right.
So his background is as a breeder, and I would say he leads one of the premier public breeding programs for hemp in the US, developing cultivars that are compliant and that are adapted to the conditions that we have here in the Northeast is essential. And I think public breeding programs have been an incredibly important part of that for other commodity crops. And I'm really proud that we are the leaders in that here at Cornell.
Nice. You were mentioning, what did you call it, synthesis before? So that seems like a good example of synthesis, taking information from one field and applying it to the other.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I would say, there's needs for both. The European industry as well as Asian industries have already solved a whole lot of problems when it comes to fiber hemp production and processing. And part of what we can do to advance our industry here in the US is really spend some time thinking about what's been done really well already in those markets and applying that knowledge rather than spending a whole bunch of time creating brand new knowledge. And I feel really lucky actually to have been invited to be a member of the scientific committee for the European Industrial Hemp Association. So that's a group of us that gets together every few months to talk about, it's, the European Industrial Hemp Association. So we talk really about what's already been done and what's working very well in the European context. I'm also a member in that group's fiber and textile working group.
Okay.
As well. So I'm getting a lot of insight that I bring back here to Cornell and to the US on what's been going well in Europe. So
is there that same level of communication and cooperation with the Chinese hemp industry?
I would say it's somewhat less, and honestly a big issue. One is language barriers. So especially when it comes to synthesizing knowledge, many people are publishing research in Europe, they're publishing it in English. That's not always the case in China. So there is a language barrier to being able to access all of that information. And so we may need to, rely and lean on some of our public institutions like the Foreign Agricultural Service, for example, to help us really understand what China and other Asian countries are doing really well. That's allowing them to, right now they're the leading textile producers for hemp in the world.
So speaking of synthesis, I think this is a good way to segue back to the workshop that's happening on November 15th. So can you tell me again the name of the workshop and who's hosting it?
It is the National Hemp Industry Needs Workshop. And this is an event that is co-hosted by the Global Hemp Innovation Center at Oregon State University, as well as by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The goal, again, is to bring in a whole bunch of voices to contribute to the synthesis of knowledge and to understand what our needs are and how we can work together as public institutions with private partners in order to build our knowledge and put that to use. I would encourage all of your listeners to find out more about that at hempindustryresearchneeds.org. That's all one word. The workshop event will be held on the 15th. If they go to the website, there is maybe an opportunity for them to continue to participate in that public survey about what their particular research needs are, or to watch all of the talks that were contributed as a way of starting this conversation by experts from across the industry. And they should certainly register for this event by November 11th for the November 15th live event. Once you register, you will get all of the information for joining that meeting by Zoom.
Great. It sounds like an amazing opportunity, amazing workshop. So Heather, before we go, tell me how people can get in touch with you directly. I mean, would you want people to email you questions or?
Absolutely. I am never sad to see questions about particular pests show up in my inbox or on my Instagram at Heather Grab. You can find me also on LinkedIn just by searching for Heather Grab, but especially for folks who are interested in our master's program or for industry partners who might want to work with our students, I would encourage you as well to reach out directly to me by email. My email is heathergrab, all one word, HEATHERGRAB at Cornell, CORNELL.edu.
Dr. Heather Grab from Cornell, it is such a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much, Eric, for having me. I hope there's an opportunity to come back and continue this conversation about our industry needs with your listeners.
I would love that. Thank you. All right. Well, that's super cool to hear about the hemp program at Cornell University. I look forward to learning more about the hemp program at Cornell. Anyway, if you want to contact Dr. Grab, I've got those links on the show page for this episode, so go there to lancasterfarming.com. So my name is Eric Herlock. I'm the digital editor at Lancaster Farming Newspaper, the greatest agricultural newspaper in the world. Check us out online, get yourself a subscription, maybe become a sponsor of our podcast. The possibilities are endless. Anyway, you can always get in touch with me. Send an email to podcast@lancasterfarming.com. All right, until next time, I will see you in the newspaper.
Industrial hemp.
Season 2, Episode 41 of the Lancaster Farming Industrial Hemp Podcast is copyright 2022 by Lancaster Farming Newspaper, part of the Steinman Communications family. Today's show was written and recorded, edited and produced by Eric Herlock. The music you hear throughout the show is courtesy of Tin Bird Shadow.